Thank you, Mac Watson, for that lovely introduction, and thank you to the School of Advanced Research for inviting me today, and all of you people who came up in the snow. I'm going to kind of walk you into space for a little while, and luckily we have some fabulous images that NASA has provided. Well, most of you know what archaeologists do. You may be an archaeologist yourself. Usually we work in the dirt, preferably in ancient and exotic places, and they have ruins. And most of you know what they study is features and artifacts. Here's an example of some of the stuff archaeologists look at, projectile points. I know Dave Eck is a specialist in this, describing the material, the way it's made, if there's reuse, the style, the dating. So that's kind of the typical idea of archaeologists. I believe our lives submit to archaeology. And this is an ephemeral site I created on Sunday at my kitchen counter and when I was working on this presentation. So archaeology is the study of the relationships between patterns of material culture and patterns of human behavior. We can study cultural material at all times, whether it's 50 years ago or last Sunday. And present material culture is never off limits to archaeologists. Archaeology can also be done anywhere that human behavior takes place. So I chose to look at the moon. It has been done now on all continents and even underwater, and it can be done on material off the Earth, in orbit, in outer space, or on other celestial bodies like the moon or Mars. The moon is rightfully everyone's cultural property, but no humans had physically been there till about 1969. And interestingly, we are fascinated with those wonderful projectile points and Mimbres pottery, but very recent material culture looks like junk and obsolete. Brooks and Barclay have called a material culture which is valued, collected, and studied durable objects, but that is discarded and pushed aside are called transient objects and thought of as disposable and obsolete. Engineers are very interested in designing the next great thing, and what was cutting edge today is tomorrow's trash. So these are two objects from the Apollo 11 site, and we can analyze data for this collection bag and this gong, just in the same way that we can analyze those prehistoric projectile points. What is space archaeology? Well, it's basically the archaeology of material culture in outer space that is clearly the result of human behavior. In its broadest sense, it is cultural material out there. It is cultural material that is exo-atmospheric, which is part of a larger assemblage, some of which, until a certain point in time and technological development, was confined to the Earth. And then it entered the archaeological record somewhere else. So space archaeology includes all material culture in the aerospace and aeronautical realms that relates to the development and support of exo-atmospheric realms. It encompasses human behavior on Earth, which anchor all space materials. This is Voyager 1 and 2. They were launched in 1977. And Voyager 1 is now 20 billion kilometers, traveling at 37,000 miles per hour into outer space. And it is currently the artifact which is human and farthest away from Earth. Now, space archaeology posits a cultural landscape that is vast and interconnecting. It's materials that originate on Earth and incorporate all human materials off the Earth. So here's a view of some of the materials and places that are important in this. These two slides, this is Honeysuckle, this is Parkes, Australia with a radio telescope, and it's still functioning, it still listens. This is Honeysuckle Creek in Australia, which is a concrete pad. Now both of these had radio telescopes that broadcast the first images of the guys who walked on the moon. This is the Apollo 11 launch complex, which changed a little as they did different flights, but is still there. This is Baikonur in Kazakhstan, and this is where the Soviets launched in 1955 some of their first rockets, and it's still going strong. If you want to go to the International Space Station, that's where you have to go. This is the gantry at Launch Complex 33 in White Sands, and this is where the V2 rocket was developed. And then this is the Holloman test track. Okay? So all the sites associated with space archaeology are linked together in what is called the cultural landscape. And their part in early exploration of space happened during the Cold War period. The history of the exploration of space in general, and the moon in particular, is mostly a Cold War phenomenon. And in 1945, the US and the USSR engaged in a race to get both rocket scientists from Germany and V2 rockets. And this V2 rocket shown here at White Sands Missile Range was developed by Wernher von Braun and his companion scientists, and this became the basis for Cold War missile technology. A decade later, its descendants launched the first satellites, and later, the first people to go on the moon. So the Cold War was played out not only on Earth in political, military, and social maneuvering, but also in outer space. In 1958, there was a competition, 57, 58. The International Geophysical Year gave a prize to who put the first satellite in orbit. And the Russians won. Space provided an arena for the antagonism in the Cold War. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik 1, and it was an 83-kilogram satellite. Stayed in orbit for about 3 months. And this great technological achievement was really overshadowed by the Cold War fears. A month later, the Soviets put up this poor, unfortunate dog named Laika. There's a whole series of hero Soviet dogs that went into space. We had a lot of Spotnicks at this time, but finally in 1958, Explorer 1 was launched by the US and put into orbit, and that discovered the Van Allen belts. Also, we put this up. And this is a 1.3 kilogram Voyager 1. This established the pear shape of the Earth, and it is still circling above us today every 2 hours. You know it's important because it has its own website. So NASA predicts it to stay in orbit for another 600 years. So it currently remains the oldest human object in space. Now, the space exploration era is usually understood in a space race model with a strong emphasis on the technological achievements of the US and its relationship to the USSR in the Cold War. So these early satellites provided the basis for the robotic and then later the manned missions. And the primary goal became focused in the late 60s on the moon. Besides Sputnik, the former Soviet Union had many firsts. They had the first cosmonaut in space in 1961, and they were somehow not afraid to put a woman in space. So in 1963, Valentina Tereshkovna went into space as an astronaut. Took us till 1983 to finally trust Sally Ride not to freak out on the controls. The Russians also had the first robotic spacecraft to land on the moon, Luna 2. And here's a slide of some of the manned and robotic missions that placed more than 40 objects into the lunar orbit. Several missions were intentionally deorbited and today make up a small population of lunar orbital debris and also debris on the moon. Several vehicles went to the moon and were returned intentionally, and some of them were sent to their destruction or rest on the moon. And there are about 81 sites on the moon, and that's counting the recent arrival of China. Roughly, there are over 190 metric tons of cultural material on the moon. Now, not all the sites are plotted here, but you can see some of them. The red is the Luna sites, and those are the sites that the Soviets put up. Those are all robotic. The green is the Apollo sites, which were manned, and then the one is a Surveyor. Those are early robotic sites. So these acts of heroic discovery to go where no man had gone before or firmly linked to nationalistic and colonial aspirations of spacefaring nations in the Cold War. And space, from the 50s to the 70s, and perhaps even today, is thought of as kind of a place of an ideological vacuum. It's a wild place to be conquered, and so far we haven't met anybody there. So going to space and to the other celestial bodies is an act of exploration that takes us to the ultimate high frontier. But it's also tied in a global landscape to conquest. I had the privilege of meeting Frank Borman, and he said to me, he was the astronaut Apollo 8, he said, the Apollo program wasn't a voyage of exploration or an expertise in advancing technology, it was a battle in the Cold War. So as such, these sites are part of the history of the Cold War in the United States and Russia and the world. And I got into this because I had a question. One of my students said, what's on the moon and does federal preservation law apply? And I had no idea. So we started to ask for money. And in 1999 through 2001, the New Mexico Space Grant Consortium, which is part of NASA at NMSU, allowed us to have money to focus on looking at what was on the moon. We chose the Apollo 11 site to focus on because it was the most obvious one, iconic, worthy of preservation, and a good test case for U.S. federal preservation law. I believe it's the first time anybody had ever looked at Tranquility Base as an archaeological site. 2 humans landed there July 20th, 1969. I can see from the hair color in the audience that many of you watched that. So it was an extraordinary moment. 600 million people either listened or watched it. And 2 astronauts, Aldrin and Armstrong, stayed on the moon for 21.6 hours, while Michael Collins circled above. Well, what do we know about the site? Here's the iconic footprint. This is in situ. Briefly, in archaeological terms, it would be considered a feature. Another example of a feature would be an ancient hearth stain. Well, first we discovered to our surprise that NASA neither had a complete inventory, and so we started rummaging around in archives at the Smithsonian, JPL, Houston, looking for what was there on the site. And we developed a list that's probably not complete of 106 artifacts and features, ranging from footprints to passive solar experiments to emesis bags. So here's some of the inventory. Let me point out a couple of things. Space boots. They were told to take off their space boots and junk them. A lot of things were not exactly scientific in nature. Commemorative plaques, an olive branch was left on the moon. And here's an example of some of the things, and I'll talk about 2 of them. The one is this one in the middle. It's the Lunar Laser Ranging Retroreflector. That's still functioning, okay? It's still being used by the Apache Point Observatory, and it was very important in measuring the exact distance from the Earth to the Moon of 378,000 kilometers. It proved that the Moon is receding from the Earth at about 3.5 centimeters per year, and that the lunar core is less than 350 kilometers. And it is still returning data. Now, there are scientific equipment, and then there's this. This is the Apollo 1 mission patch, and this is to commemorate the astronauts who died tragically in an earlier accident. And the astronauts took that up there. This is some of the other objects that are on the moon at Tranquility Base. Usually when I talk about this, people are very interested in the urine bags. And they are there. One of my colleagues said probably because of the changes in temperature, the urine is gone, but the plastic's still there. But you can see a lot of them are technological, scientific equipment that was left there as they were making that first exploration. Well, one of the first things they did on landing on the moon was to place an American flag on the moon. And this is an act that is set by historic precedent to claim territory. So to the Soviets, this must have signaled a defeat in space. We name things after our own cultures. The capsule they traveled on was the Columbia. The one they landed on the moon was the Eagle. So these are both metaphors for America. Well, any archaeologist knows we can't go to a site and revisit a site except that we need to make a map of it. And remember, this is 45, almost 46 years later. So we pieced together drawings and different information that we got, and we came up with this one. It's about the same size as a soccer field. It's about 2 acres, almost 2 acres. And during our project, we knew that it would be both artifacts and features. The features would include the trails and the boot prints. And they rival, I think, the footprints at Lake Tolly 3.6 million years ago. We created this based on the USGS Service Traverses map, and we revised the map based on what Lou Binford told me. And he was the one that created the toss zone model for the Nunavut Eskimo, who were sitting around a campfire and tossing things out. The astronauts for 8 minutes stood on the limb after they had collected 20 kilograms of lunar material and were told to jettison anything that wasn't important to them. Remember, they had only one plan, which was to land and take off. There was no rescue plan. So they created this toss zone, and this is an example of where we think some of the artifacts landed. This map is really just a sketch map of what happened at Tranquility Base. But why should we worry about creating a complete archaeological inventory and an accurate map of Tranquility Base? Is there any imminent natural or cultural threat to these sites, or to this site in particular? Is the Apollo 11 Tranquility Base site one of those places that, as Keith Atchison said, required such great technological investment for humanity to reach in the first instance that they have simply never returned to it? Since sites on the moon have been protected from any adverse effects by their very inaccessibility and their remoteness. I had hoped to be the first lunar archaeologist, but I was very disappointed that I don't have that distinction, because this guy does. On November 19th, 1969, astronaut Alan Bean and Pete Conrad landed on the moon, just a few feet from where Surveyor 3 had landed before. They mapped the site, took pictures, took examples of the artifacts, and wrote kind of a forensic anthropology investigation of it. So, as such, this Apollo 12 mission provides the first example of extraterrestrial archaeology in the emerging field of space heritage and archaeology. Pete Capillotti wrote that this is the first example of formational archaeology and the study of environmental and cultural forces upon the life history of human artifacts in space. So if that's the only human visit to an archaeological site since 1969, why should we worry about preservation now? Well, I would argue that the sites on the moon are critical components to the sites on Earth. Without being on the moon, if they lose their locational integrity, they lose part of their extraordinary significance. We need to preserve these places on the moon. As I said earlier, I became interested because the student asked the question, does federal preservation law apply on the moon? And that was a tricky one. This is the UN Outer Space Treaty of 1967, and basically what it says is, if a nation or state puts something on another celestial body, they retain ownership entitled to that, whether it's objects or personnel. So NASA, in effect, doesn't consider their property to be abandoned, and it is then the federal agency which owns this historic property. As such, they fall under U.S. federal preservation law, essentially the National Historic Preservation Act, which requires an agency to inventory and take into account undertakings on their property which is eligible to the National Register. Some of you are real familiar with this. Basically, the site has to possess integrity of locations, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association, which I think Tranquility Base does on the Moon. It also has to meet one or more of these criteria, and I would argue it meets all of them. Criterion A is a huge event in our history, associated with the lives of significant people, the astronauts, 4 presidents, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Eisenhower. It meets the requirements of Criterion C because the assemblage on the Moon represents the science and engineering that went into making it possible. It has been argued that it took 60,000 people to put those 2 guys on the Moon. When they landed on the Moon, one of my colleagues said their computer prototypes consumed roughly 2/3 of the world's total supply of integrated circuits. The skills to accomplish this required the entire Apollo program to have many masters, many experts. And some of them are unsung. I had a student come up to me when I was teaching, and she handed me a little tiny bolt, and she says, "My dad gave me this. He values this more than anything." And it was a bolt that he had created for the Apollo 11 capsule. So I would argue that this meets all the criteria. It also beats the 50-year rule because it is a site of exceptional significance. And it also could be a National Historic Landmark because it meets the criterion of being representative of a great idea of the American people. And the U.S. Department of Defense has a man in space program, and they include the launch pad at Cape Canaveral as a National Historic Landmark. Well, the only difference between this site and the site on the Moon is that the artifacts are off the Earth. So the Tranquility Base is the critical component to the significance of this site. So our Lunar Legacy Project in 2000 decided to write a letter to NASA. And as such, we proposed nominating the Apollo 11 site as a National Historic Landmark. It was clearly a surprise for NASA. It's not always a good sign when the first response you get is from a lawyer. And you can see here that the deputy counsel thought that the international community would perceive it as being a claim over the Moon. Then we got a response from the keeper of the register. I think they were working together. But even if the response was not what we desired, one of the best outcomes was bringing the issue of lunar preservation to relevant U.S. preservation authorities. Tranquility Base also meets the World Heritage Convention criteria for preservation of sites of outstanding universal value. That was written in the 70s, and they didn't include space in that. The U.S. signed that and has pledged to preserve the listed landmarks. But before that can happen, the U.S. as a state party must nominate it to the World Heritage List. So does anybody see the irony? We plunk down a flag, the UN's treaty gives us rights to the artifacts, and I believe that federal preservation laws apply, but NASA states that making it an NHL would be perceived as a U.S. claim of sovereignty, and the keeper of the registrar came up with this policy in June of 2000. I think our requests were both surprising and a bit threatening, but I'm also aware that there is sufficient political issues that can change, and these perceptions and policies did change. So who or what will preserve Tranquility Base, and when will it happen? Its remoteness has kept it safe for 50 years, and can't we as archaeologists use this cutting-edge technology, which I'll show you in a minute, missions like the LRO, which has photographed the Moon, to map the Moon's surface, and can't we retrieve the archaeological data from these missions and forget about going there ever again? So the big question is, why worry about the lack of legal and political commitment and the responsibility for preservation of this site? And what about the other sites on the moon? There's more than one, equally important. And there are other sites on celestial bodies, on asteroids, on Mars. If these untouchable sites have not been touched in many, many years, why be concerned now? Well, I would argue without a commitment to preservation and lack of legal structures to deal with them as cultural and historic resources, we leave them vulnerable to impacts in the future. And 6 months later, the ways in which we as scientists could develop methods to remotely survey and record sites in space would be a waste without a preservation framework in place. And because of the nature of this undertaking, it must be international in scope. The '67 treaty did not address historic preservation, and I don't think many people at the time thought about it. The treaty did attempt to regulate how Earth's people treated territory beyond its own bounds, and today I would argue that what was once inaccessible has become more accessible in the last 10 years. The space race culminated with NASA and human landings from '69 to '72. And there's a new space race, and it has components of the Cold War, but many new players and commercial interests. As well as the US, other nations now have space programs, including EU, Japan, Russia, India, Canada, Australia, and now China. This may be a scarier scenario for preservation. Now, I know there are skeptics about ever going back to the moon or the money we need to do this and the ability of NASA to meet the challenge, but I believe in the future we will go back. In retrospect, in '69, who could have predicted that you eventually have to hook up with a Russian to get yourself on the International Space Station? You can even buy a ride now as a personal individual if you're rich enough. New Mexico has a spaceport. Unfortunately, my tax dollars went there. But an EIS has been completed and a record of decision has been signed. And in 2007, this Star Trek guy, James Doolin, ascended, not him, I'm sorry, his ashes, ascended into space 387,000 feet above the Earth. The X Prize has a competition for commercial space companies to land on the moon, and NASA is a willing partner to many of these commercial space endeavors. Not one, as far as I know, has a space heritage or archaeology component. But of course, getting into space is a very risky business, and we know that just based on the tragic accident with Spaceship Two. So let's look at our progress. Well, the World Archaeological Congress came together in 2003, and as our motto, we took Neil Armstrong's quote, not the one about giant step for mankind, but he said, yeah, we left a few things up there. So we estimate again that it's been, since the beginning, 190 metric tons of material, most of it around the lunar equator. And in 2003, we got together with a group of Canadians, Americans, and Australians and created a very underfunded Space Heritage Task Force. We've had 3 symposia at the SAA, and we had a meeting at ICOMOS in Cairns, Australia, on extreme heritage. But this is only a start. We need to include more countries, certainly the former Soviet Union and those countries, and China. If the first landing on the moon was a giant leap for mankind, then today humankind must take another leap into the preservation of space sites. So back here to New Mexico, in 2006, with the help of Bill Doman, we nominated this site and wrote about it for the ARMS database. So it is now LA 2 million. And this is the first space site to be registered in the world. Its correlates in the database, it should be in New Mexico. So what we did is we asked the New Mexico Museum of Space History to anchor the site. So the coordinates are at Alamogordo in that museum, and they're linked to the coordinates on the moon. So this is the first literally out of this world site in New Mexico. Working with my colleagues in California in January 2010, Tranquility the objects and structures at Tranquility Base were put into the California Register of Cultural Properties. Then in April of 2010, we proposed to nominate it to the New Mexico State Register of Cultural Properties. Our state law only requires that we demonstrate the site's relevance to the history and the culture of New Mexico. It does not have to be in New Mexico. So we had many ways to demonstrate this. This is Ham. This is the first chimpanzee in space. His remains are buried at the Space Museum in Alamogordo. These two sites are from the V2 rocket and Launch Complex 33 in White Sands. And then this is a great picture. Does anybody know who this is? He's not as famous as Felix Baumgarten, who was the guy that jumped, you know, the farthest out from a balloon and fell to Earth. This is Colonel Joe Kittinger. And in 1960, he holds the world record jumping from a balloon and plunging for 4 minutes and 32 seconds from a height of 102,800,000 feet, or 19.5 miles above the Earth. And it's just he holds that record still. It's just an amazing thing a New Mexican did. I believe the man is still alive. Okay. We'll get to where Mac introduced me. In 2010, with the help of some of my CRM students and with Mac Watson's leadership, we went ahead and the Cultural Properties Review Committee unanimously voted to put it on the State Register of Cultural Properties. So this was a start, and a good start. But there are many other sites that are equally deserving of recognition and preservation. There are 5 other manned Apollo sites, and there was a total of a little more than 20 days spent on the moon. Although most of the historic lunar locations are well known, surprisingly, the ascent stage of the Apollo 11 spacecraft, which was jettisoned when they reconnected up with the command module, is unknown. There are also those very early Russian Luna sites. The sites on the moon are not the kind of property that was envisioned when the U.S. preservation law was created, when the National Register was put in place. They are recent past properties for which we don't have a lot of expertise. The artifacts are in a different world, in a different scale, and they are not within anybody's national boundaries. They are not even on Earth. Also, space is a living system, and NASA doesn't particularly want to be in the business of preserving stuff. The new space era involves many countries, diverse, competitive, commercial issues. If space sites are still not claimable or treatable under current preservation agreements, we may need to amend the existing Outer Space Treaty, or perhaps a UNESCO resolution to broaden the World Heritage List. Let it include things in orbit. Let it include things in space. House Bill 2617 in 2013 was brought forward by 2 women to declare all the sites, U.S. sites on the moon, as lunar national parks. This, again, never got out of committee and was perceived as a claim of sovereignty. It's difficult to know what to preserve from any site at any historical place. And obviously criteria has to be developed to what is worthy of preservation. The sites on the moon are particularly difficult because at present time we are unsure of exactly what they look like. Temperatures on the moon swing between 125 degrees centigrade to minus 156 degrees centigrade. There are other potential natural effects like solar radiation, wind, and micrometeorite impacts. We do not know exactly what we will find at the Apollo 11 site after 46 years, even without human impacts. Notice this, what I call gold foil on the base of the LEM. It's a thermal material called kapton. Now, on blastoff, it's meant to shatter. Is every small piece of kapton a significant artifact? And again, we have to make decisions about what's significant and what's important to preserve. It's believed that the American flag on 11 was posted very close to where they took off, and it fell over. It may now be a bleached skeleton on a metal pole, but it should still be there. And the material culture of space is not confined solely to the moon. This is the Jstor Tracker. There are 3 areas around the Earth defined as orbits. One is Leo, or low Earth orbit, and that's from 160 to 2,000 kilometers above the circle, in altitude above the Earth. Geosynchronous orbit, which is about to 36,000 kilometers. And the majority of the objects in space around the Earth are in Leo. And what you see here is approximately 900 Earth orbiting satellites. And they are cataloged by this software. The largest is this International Space Station, which is still up there. And in can't remember the exact year, a private commercial space company called Celestis started a new spin on manned spaceflight, and it deposited the cremains of, among others, Timothy Leary and Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, in space. So there are the cremains of 94 people running around. 6,000 spacecraft have been launched in the 5 decades of spaceflight and are still in space. And the majority of debris are from spacecraft and inactive satellites. In 2012, for example, a working U.S. Iridium-33 satellite was destroyed by an out-of-service Soviet space satellite. And it blew into pieces at an altitude of about 490 miles above the Earth. The Space Surveillance Network looks at 400,000 observations a day and tracks 21,000 human objects in orbit that are larger than 10 centimeters. If there's an estimated 100,500,000 particles less than a centimeter up to 10 centimeters, which are circling us. So space is a cultural landscape that includes artifacts which are floating or continually moving, but they're tied to Earth by their launching. The future for space. 2007, Google announced the SpaceX Prize, and the Lunar X Prize has been extended till December 31st, 2016. I guess they're still working on those designs. And it is for the first private robotic spacecraft to land on the moon. And for a $5 million bonus, they can image Apollo hardware. Read here the artifacts. So if they get there, they run the risk of obliterating or damaging these. So these are the challenges that the Space Heritage sees: to recognize the material culture and the places associated with space exploration, and to encourage a commitment by national preservation authorities to create an international structure and to work together to properly manage the cultural heritage of space. I realize this is a huge job. We also are competing against the nostalgia for space objects and their commercial market value. When I was working with NASA on the guidelines, I pulled this up on the website, and this little pin flag carried by Apollo astronaut Charles Duncan on 16 was auctioned off for $16,500. Recently we got both technological and preservation help from NASA, and it was in the form of the L-Cross mission. It carried the LRO, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which collected images that it flew over the surface of the moon, dipped down to a height of about 33 kilometers above the surface, and took the most wonderful pictures of the moon that had been seen in a long time. It was not quite the resolution I wanted as an archaeologist, but again, they're fabulous images. So I want to quickly go through a few of those. With the power and resolution, scientists were able to pick out things that were lost on the moon. This is the Lunokhod 1, which is a rover, and the Luna 17 spacecraft, that's this one here in the corner. Now these are LRO images, okay, all of them except for this picture of the Lunokhod. The Luna 17 spacecraft launched by the former Soviet Union in 1970, lost track of it. It traveled 6.5 miles, And it was located by a New Mexico team working at NMSU at the Apache Point Observatory using this technology. It's the first remotely controlled lunar rover, and it is certainly deserving of preservation and protection. So this LRO technology is a boon both for cultural and lunar geographers as well as archaeologists. So of the LRO sites on the moon, I've chosen mostly the Apollo 11, but if you go on the NASA site, it's photographed all of the Apollo sites. Okay. That is the picture of Alan Bean with Surveyor 3, and there's Apollo 12. And this LRO image and this one are from the LRO camera. This is an interesting image. As Armstrong, who was probably the greatest pilot in the world, descended, he realized he was going to land in a crater, and so he took over manual control, and he piloted that spacecraft to a safe location. So this is coming down to Mare Tranquillitas, where he landed at Tranquility Base. This is the image of that site taken in 2009 by the LRO, and you can see clearly that this is the limb. These are some of the experiments, and I'll show you some better imaging from that project. You can clearly see the little west crater they traveled to in the limb. And now at a closer angle, you can see the foot trails. They're still there. You can see various implements and experiments that they put on the moon at the time in July 20th, 1969. This is the limb, okay? And there's Aldrin walking down from the ladder on the limb. Here's the Lunar Laser Ranging Retroreflector, and again, it's about the size of a bread box. It is a series of mirrors that we shoot lasers to, and again, this and 3 others are still working. This is the passive seismic experiment, which was meant to record any earthquakes on the moon. It recorded the takeoff of the limb from the surface. And then this is a montage taken at the time, and you can see in the LRO image in the upper right of where they had landed. Now I said NASA gave us also preservation help, and that came in the form of these guidelines. And I was an invited consultant with Roger Lanius from Smithsonian Air and Space and a bunch of NASA scientists to work on these. They were issued in 2011. And they are guidelines and recommendations. They are not specifically citing federal preservation law, but they do put on record that NASA has a commitment to preserve the scientific and historic value of all U.S. lunar sites. They singled out 11 and 17 as of particular significance and created in the recommendations a 2.5-kilometer buffer around those 2 sites. So this is a big step for lunar archaeologists. In the end, it's not only the U.S. who should be involved. There needs to be a series of agreements among spacefaring nations to preserve their own and each other's heritage. Only with a world buy-in will there be extraordinary archaeological sites protected by the international community. And who would have thought in 1969 that the Chinese would get there, even in 2000? It put its little first robotic spacecraft on the moon in December of 2013. Chang'e and U2 are the spacecraft and the little rover that went out in the Mare Inebrium. Although it failed to rove very far, the messages indicate how invested China and how fond China was culturally of their spacecraft. There's a whole series of dialogues between Chang'e, who is the moon goddess, and U2, which is the little jade rabbit, about come back to mama, and all these wonderful stories. So this created another archaeological sites. Oh, and by the way, those LRO images, LRO crashed on the south pole of the moon in 2010, and that created yet another archaeological site. So I want to end with some ideas. The moon has been known and is a presence in the night sky for all cultures. Stars and other celestial bodies have been named, used to navigate, track the seasons, and tell stories about. So space has probably been important to us as long as we have been humans. Each population has a relationship and rights to the moon through their culture, through their language, their stories, their architecture, their calendars, and their subsistence practices. This is taken at Chaco Canyon, a planetarium of rock art, probably dating to about 1054 AD, and this is the crescent moon and probably the Crabs supernova. Stonehenge, 4,500 years ago, where great stones were placed by prehistoric people to orient that structure to the moon's northernmost setting, which is the midwinter moonrise, and its southernmost moonrise, the northernmost moon setting, that's the midwinter moonset, and its southernmost rising, which is the midsummer moonrise. And then this little Mayan goddess up here, who is the symbol for water and is closely associated with the tides. And the story goes that the Mayans the gods had great fires in the sky, but they were equally bright. So they wanted one to be less bright than the other. So a rabbit was hopping nearby, and they took the rabbit and threw it against the bright orb in the sky, and that became the moon. So the moon is a place where memories are stored. It is a point of reference for community knowledge, and it is transformed by traditional stories into a place of significance. In the Yukon, Canada, where I work with elders, the moon got created because it was kept by a chief in a box, and Crow wanted it, their trickster god, turned himself into a pine needle, and when the chief's daughter came down to drink, he slipped inside her, and then was born as Crow. And when he was born, he cried to his grandfather for the moon, and like all good grandfathers, he gave him the moon, and he threw it up into the sky. We also have a few images of popular culture. Western popular culture embraced the moon during the early 50s with music and dramatic series. You're probably not familiar with this band, the Spotnicks. They were a Swedish band in 1963, and until last fall were still traveling and playing. Some of you may recognize this little Telstar by the Tornadoes. Do 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 do. Okay. I'm not a singer. Star Trek. Tang was never invented by NASA, but it was given to the Mercury astronauts who said it tasted terrible. And then Star Wars, etc. The most recent one is this one, and that's Chris Hadfield, the first Canadian astronaut, who, if you go on YouTube, you can hear him sing David Bowie's Space Oddity. Ground control to Major Tom. So we still have a relationship to space in our own popular culture. I'm going to leave you with a last image. Some of you may know this. It is the small blue dot right here. Nope. Right here, which is Earth. This was taken from the Voyager 1 spacecraft, 3.7 billion miles away from Earth. It is now the most distant human object in space, and it contains the engraved messages that Carl Sagan wanted put on the spacecraft when it left our solar system. So we have done many extraordinary explorations away from Earth. But Earth is where we all sit today, on this planet, in this country, in this city, and in this room. And it's the only home that we really know. So as we value and fight to protect our important, significant resources here on this blue dot, we must value and protect places we have been for the first time in human history. We have unconscionably lost, and we continue to lose, many extraordinary sites on our little blue dot. We should not lose Earth's heritage on the moon. It is even a smaller dot where we have left our human mark. Thank you. Okay. This is a shameless plug for a couple of books if you're interested in more reading.